Last week, I spoke to a SaaS founder with a great product, customers who genuinely love what he built. And he said to me, Frank, I know we need to sharpen our ICP, but honestly, I'm scared. If we narrow our focus, we cut out a huge chunk of the market, and that's pipeline we'd just be walking away from. And I told him he had it completely backwards. Because here's what actually happened. 6 months after they narrowed their ICP, cutting it significantly and removing entire categories of companies they had been chasing, their pipeline didn't shrink, it grew. The sales cycle shortened, their content started performing, and their close rate improved. Every single part of GTM got better the moment they stopped trying to sell to everyone. And that's not a lucky outcome. That's a pattern I've seen repeat across dozens of companies. And the fear that drives founders to resist it, the fear that narrowing means losing, is one of the most expensive misconceptions in B2B SaaS marketing. In the next few minutes, I want to show you exactly why that fear is wrong, and what actually happens to your GTM when you narrow your ICP, and why every founder who avoids this decision ends up paying for it in ways that rarely show up obviously on a spreadsheet. I'm Frank Husman. I built and sold a B2B SaaS company, and for the last few years, I work with over 40 founders on go-to-market strategy. The conversation I just described, I've had it so many times, it's just crazy. They were with different founders, of course, on different products, but it was the same fear almost every time, and the same wrong assumption underneath it. The conventional logic about ICP goes something like this. Your ICP is a filter on your market. The broader the filter, the more companies you can go after. And the more companies you can go after, the more pipeline you have. So narrowing the filter means losing pipeline. It's just math. That logic feels airtight, but it's also completely wrong. What the thinking misses is that your ICP isn't just a targeting parameter, it's the foundation of your entire messaging system. And the moment you try to write messaging that works for everyone, for the mid-market company and for the enterprise, for the founder-led startup and the VP of sales-led operation, you end up writing messaging that genuinely works for no one. Think about what a broad ICP actually does to your copy. You can't speak to a specific pain because you'd need a different version of it for every type of buyer. The context keeps shifting, so you end up writing about what your product does rather than about the problem itself. And feature-level messaging has no pull. It describes, it doesn't resonate. So when you narrow your ICP, something shifts. Now you can write about the specific buyer's situation. Not, we help B2B companies improve their go-to-market, but we help B2B SaaS founders at 500K to 2 million ARR who are still personally closing every important deal and know that they can scale. The right person reads that and stops. They don't evaluate where you might be relevant. They already know you are. And that shift from this might apply to me to this is written about me is the difference between content that gets scrolled past and content that builds trust. And trust in B2B SaaS is what converts. Not awareness, not impressions, it's trust. Let me show you how this actually plays out. Because Dreamdata tracks real deal journeys across B2B companies. Their 2026 benchmark puts the average buying cycle at 272 days. That's 9 months during which your buyer is researching independently, forming opinions, building a mental shortlist with almost no vendor involvement. So 81% of this research happens before sales ever picks up the phone. Think about what it means for the ICP problem. During those 272 days, your buyer is reading content, watching videos, comparing approaches. If your content is generic, it disappears into the noise. Not because it's bad, but because it's not addressed to anyone specific. And if your content speaks directly to their situation, they notice it, they remember it, and they start associating your thinking with the category of problem they're trying to solve. By the time a well-targeted buyer actually reaches out, the founder with a sharp ICP isn't starting a sales conversation. They're confirming a decision that was already 80% made. And the broad ICP founder, they're still introducing themselves, still establishing basic credibility, still trying to explain why they're relevant, and they're competing for trust that the other founder earned months ago because their content actually spoke to that buyer's specific reality. Let me give you an example. I work with a SaaS company that built project management software. A good product, strong retention among customers who actually implemented it properly. They were positioning to any company that runs complex projects. Consulting firms, marketing agencies, IT teams, you name it. A wide horizontal market. And that's exactly what made it a trap. A product manager running 2-week software sprints and a construction project manager running 3 job sites simultaneously are not the same buyer. One is coordinating internal teams on a shared backlog. The other is tracking subcontractors across multiple sites, managing change orders that blow up the budget if they're not caught early, and trying to figure out why a project that was on track at 30% completion is suddenly over budget 70%. The vocabulary is different, the pressure is different, and the moment of pain is completely different. Their content had to stay generic enough to speak to all of them, which meant it said nothing specific to any of them. When they narrowed specifically to construction companies, the content could finally describe something real. The budget overrun that only becomes visible when it's too late to recover, a change order that gets agreed verbally on site and costs you 6 weeks later when no one documented it properly, that's something a construction project manager reads and immediately recognizes. Content started getting shared in contractor and project management communities, and sales conversations shifted from, can you tell us more about what you do, to, we've seen your content on change order management, and that's exactly the problem we're dealing with. The buyers showing up were already sold on the category. They were choosing between options, and this company had already established it understood their world. That's the mechanism. Narrow ICP creates specific messaging, and specific messaging means the right buyers self-identify. Buyers who self-identify arrive pre-sold, and pre-sold buyers convert faster at better rates with less sales effort required to get there. But there's a second thing that happens when you narrow your ICP, and it gets less attention because you stop competing on price. When your positioning is broad, buyers can compare you to everyone. And when buyers can compare you to everyone, they default to the most visible variable, cost. They don't have enough information to evaluate fit, so they compare on price instead. You win or lose based on your rate, not based on your understanding of their situation. And when your positioning is specific, that the comparison becomes much harder to make. Take my agency, for example. I'm not a generic marketing consultant anymore. I'm the person who's worked with 40 B2B SaaS founders specifically, who understands the GTM problems that show up at 500K to 2 million ARR. A buyer can't really compare that to a cheaper general alternative because the cheaper alternative doesn't speak their language, doesn't understand their specific pressure points, and doesn't have relevant experience to draw on. So you move from competing on price to competing on fit. And that's a competition you can actually win on merit rather than margin. And the downstream effects on every other part of your GTM compound from there. Your LinkedIn targeting gets more precise, your content starts performing, your sales cycles shorten, your retention improves, and your referrals compound. None of those improvements happen in isolation. They all flow from the same source, a clear, specific definition of who you're actually for. Here's what I see happen to founders who hold onto broad positioning for too long. They keep spending on marketing that generates activity, but not pipeline. Their content gets engagement, but not inbound conversions. Their ads drive clicks, but no demos. And they go looking for the problem in the wrong places. Maybe it's the channel, maybe it's the creative, maybe they need a different sales script. The real problem doesn't announce itself clearly. And that's the insidious part of a broad ICP. The cost doesn't show up as a line item. What you see is customer acquisition cost that's higher than it should be, a sales cycle that never seems to shorten, a close rate that plateaus. The diagnosis stays scattered because symptoms look like a sales problem or a marketing problem or a conversion problem, when really it's a positioning problem that runs through everything. You're building on a foundation that can't support the structure you're trying to put on top of it. So contrast that with what happens when the ICP is right. I had a founder reach out on LinkedIn after posting about this topic. He'd spent 18 months frustrated with his pipeline. Good products, strong retention, decent outbound results, but never any inbound to speak of. A referral occasionally, but nothing systematic. He narrowed his ICP from B2B companies that need better customer onboarding to specifically SaaS companies at early growth stage that had product market fit but hadn't formalized their onboarding process. And 6 months later, he had 3 inbound leads in a single week from people who said they'd been following his content. Not because he posted more, because the content suddenly meant something to a specific person rather than something fake to a general one. So yeah, the fear of niching down is really a fear of losing leads. I understand that fear. When pipeline feels fragile, the last thing you want to do is deliberately exclude a part of the market. But here's what I want you to carry out of this. The leads you lose when you narrow your own ICP, they were never going to convert at the rate you needed anyway. You were spending money making noise to people who weren't ready to buy from you. And not because your product wasn't strong enough, but because your messaging wasn't specific enough for trust to form. You were having conversations that were never going to go anywhere. And your sales team was working hard on deals that were long shots from the start. So narrowing your ICP doesn't shrink your market, it sharpens your aim. And in B2B SaaS, where buying cycles run 9 months and most of the decision happens before your sales team ever enters the picture, that precision is not a nice to have, it's what makes the whole system work. So in the next video, I'm going to go deeper on the buying cycle itself, specifically how to read which prospects are actually moving toward a decision before they ever raise their hand. Because once your ICP is sharp, the question becomes, how do you catch the right signal at the right moment? And if this changed how you think about your ICP, please subscribe. I'll keep unpacking how B2B SaaS founders build GTM that actually compounds. I'm Frank Husman, and I'll see you in the next video.